What's going on, everybody? Top 10 Pokemon back with another Pokemon card auctions of the week recap. Folks, I have another amazing week of auction recaps for you. In today's video, we'll be talking yet again about the demise of the Black Label McDonald's Japanese Burger Chew card and the price points it's been hitting this past week in auction, and there were a lot of auctions of this card. And we'll also be talking about some insane first edition base set sales that came by as well, with new record prices of course. A lot to cover in today's episode, so thank you so much for tuning in. Quick shout out to today's awesome recap sponsor. It's the one and only CantoShark.com, the ultimate Pokemon card marketplace. If you're in the market for anything from high-end vintage slabs to very competitively priced modern cards, CantoShark's got you covered. And there are hundreds of pieces of sealed product on here, folks, ranging from absolute Grail boxes to competitively priced modern boxes aplenty. CantoShark has become one of the most trustworthy and transparent sellers in this hobby, and they deal with high-end product each and every day. So go check out what they have, folks. I guarantee you will not be disappointed. A link to the CantoShark website will be in the description of this video. Thank you so much for your support, and if you pick anything up, please let me know. Alright folks, let's start this auction recap off with some sealed product on eBay. Here we have a pile of Destined Rivals booster boxes. 10 total boxes sealed, went for a total of $4,000 this week. Here is a Cosmic Eclipse booster box that sold for $4,660. Here we have a case of Lost Origin booster boxes, sold for $4,474, while this case of Fusion Strike boxes sold for $5,800. Here's a booster box of Ancient Origins, sold for $6,700 this week. Here we have a Black and White Next Destinies booster box, sold for $8,806. And then here is a case of Evolving Skies boxes, 6 boxes total, sold this week for $14,700 big ones. And then here, folks, we have a couple of the 151 UPCs. Here are 2 boxes that sold for $1,325. And then here we have 4 boxes that sold for $2,125. And man, I remember buying these boxes like a year or so ago for like 60 bucks. Now they're like, what, 530 some bucks a piece in this lot? I should have bought more. Let's talk about some more Mega Evolution cards before Phantasmal Flames comes out, and then we start talking all about those cards. Here is a Lieutenant Surge's Bargain SIR in PSA 10, sold for $355, along with this Full Art Lily's Determination that sold for $890. Here's an SIR Gardevoir EX that sold for $990, along with this Mega Lucario EX SIR that sold for $1,175 this week. And then we saw a gold Mega Lucario EX come by, and it sold for $2,950. And then we saw 2 of the Japanese Mega Charizard EX cards. Last week, if you recall, we saw a Black Label copy of this card sell. This week we saw 2 PSA 10 copies sell. This one here sold for $2,205. The other one sold for $2,250. Some more modern cards to go over. Here is the 171 Victini from Black Bolt White Flare, sold for $1,151 as a PSA 10. Here is a PSA 10 Giratina V from Lost Origin, card we haven't covered in quite a while. It is selling for $2,025 in auction. A couple of Black Label cards. Here's a Charizard GX from the Hidden Fates tins that sold for $960. Here's a Black Label Charizard GX, also from Hidden Fates, sold for $5,300. And then here is the Black Label Mewtwo V-Star from Crown Zenith that sold for $3,650 this week. And then we gotta talk about this ugly business of the Black Label Burger Chew, the 2025 McDonald's Japanese promo that is not doing very well. A month ago, folks, 5 weeks to be exact, this card was selling in auction for $21,100. But since then, it came down a couple weeks after that to about $10,988, then to $8,100, then to $7,000, then to $6,500, then to $6,108, finally landing at about $6,000 this past week. And that is a very nasty minus 72% from when it first sold 5 weeks ago. Now folks, You know as well as I do, you never know what's going to happen in this hobby. This card very well might spike back up. Who knows? But we will keep an eye on it for many, many weeks to come. Up next, we have a couple of Chinese exclusive cards. I just did a video on the Chinese exclusive cards. Here's a lot of 20 of the evolutions, all in sequential PSA cert numbers, all PSA 10s that sold for $5,200. And then we saw a very nice price for this Mew EX that sold for $24,000, also as a PSA 10. Just a couple of cards from the XY era. Again, here is a Mega Mewtwo EX that sold for $1,705, while this other Mega Mewtwo EX from Breakthrough sold for $1,955. Here we have a Primal Kyogre from Ancient Origins, sold for $2,405 this week. And then we have this Promo Blastoise EX Full Art that sold for $5,655. And then a handful of cards from the Black and White era. Here's a Full Art Zekrom in PSA 10, sold for $3,433. Here we have a Ninetales from Dragons Exalted. This is a holo in PSA 10 that sold for $1,975. Here is the Lugia EX from Plasma Storm, sold for $1,050. And then here we saw a Black Star Promo Eevee from the Black and White era. This is from the Sylveon collection, sold for $12,300. And then on to some vintage sales on eBay. We have this Black Star Promo Mew from the WotC era. This is the holo version that sold for $4,311. From Jungle, we saw a first edition Electrode sell for $1,580. From Fossil, we saw a few sales. Here's the Hypno, sold for $1,201, while the Kabutops here sold for $2,557. Here, folks, is an authenticated by PSA Cosmos Holo Articuno. Very tough to find Cosmos Holo fossil cards. This one here sold for $6,921. From Gym Challenge, we have the Sabrina's Gengar First Edition, sold for $2,251. And then a couple of cards from the Neo series. Here's a BGS 9.5 First Edition Lugia from Neo Genesis, sold this week for $6,200. Here is a PSA 10 First Edition Dark Feraligatr from Neo Destiny, sold for $1,825, while the First Edition Dark Espeon sold for $9,625. Here's an unlimited Shining Tyranitar that sold for $4,400, and then we had a Crystal Celebi sell for $9,600. A couple of tag cards that came by that hit some pretty impressive prices. Here's a Tag 10 First Edition Dark Blastoise, sold for $5,105, while this Tag 10 Gengar from Skyridge sold for $15,025. Now, I am not a tag collector myself, but these are pretty impressive prices. What do you think about them? Here we have a Japanese Shining Mew that sold as a PSA 10 for an even $9K this week. On to the old school EX era, we have this Umbreon EX from Unseen Forces, sold as a PSA 10 for $26,099. And then from EX Legend Maker, we saw this Mew EX sell for $5,257 this week. A couple of Gold Stars. Here's a PSA 9 Gold Star Mudkip that sold for an even $10,000, while the PSA 10 Gold Star Charizard sold for $58,723 big ones. Here is a regular Holo Rayquaza from EX Delta Species that sold for $1,825, while the reverse Holo copy of this card sold for $5,665. Here's a reverse holo Snorlax from Dragon Frontier, sold for $2,750. A reverse holo Kingdra from Holon Phantom sold for $3,851. From Diamond and Pearl Secret Wonders, we have this very awful looking Venusaur that sold for $1,225. Here's an Articuno from Majestic Dawn, sold for $1,975. Here we have a Rayquaza C from Supreme Victors that sold for $1,888. And then from Heart Gold Soul Silver, we have this pre-release Pichu that sold for $1,136. And then onto the Fanatics Collect weekly auction block, we have this Beautiful Mewtwo from Diamond and Pearl Majestic Dawn. This is a Pop 9 card in PSA 10, sold for $5,880, while this Holo Mewtwo from Legends Awakened sold for $6,600, also a Pop 9 card. Here we have a Mew EX from Holon Phantoms that sold for $7,500. Here's a first edition Blaine's Charizard from Gym Challenge, sold for $7,500 as well. Here we have a Staff pre-release Snorlax from Call of Legends that sold for $7,800 this week, along with this Rocket Snorlax EX in PSA 10 that sold for $9,300. Here we have a CGC 10 First Edition Tyranitar from Neo Discovery, sold for $5,160. This is a Pop 5 card, along with this CGC 10 Pristine First Edition Holo Gengar from Fossil. This sold for $9,600. And the CGC 10 Pristine Umbreon from Skyridge that sold for $14,400. And last but not least, for CGC, we have this Pristine 10 Gengar from Skyridge, sold for $18,600. Here is the first of a few base set holos that came by. The first edition Zapdos in PSA 10 sold for $15,600. We saw two first edition Shining Charizards from Neo Destiny come by. This one here sold for $21,600. The other one sold for $22,200. Here's a first edition base set Gyarados that sold for $35,400. A Crystal Lugia from Aquapolis sold for $36,000. And then the first edition base set Alakazam sold as a PSA 10 for $43,200. And then we saw this PSA 10 8,600 point Master Scroll card that sold for $45,600. And then the final two auctions were this PSA 10 first edition base set Venusaur that sold for $55,200. And then we saw this 7,200 point Japanese Espeon Prime promo card that sold for $55,200 as well. That's all I got for you today, folks. I really hope you enjoyed the recap. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. I look forward to hearing from you, and I will catch you all in my next one.